Kyrie eleison, Kyrie eleison, Christe eleison, Christe eleison, Kyrie eleison, Kyrie eleison.
Morning, everybody. It's approximately 7:40 in the morning here in the great state of Georgia on the 26th of February. And thank you all for tuning in. I just want to go and say that I'm thankful for the people that have left comments or reached out to me. I've had a very interesting phone call yesterday from a young man. I'll say in the West. I don't want to give his name, but he and I had a very good phone call. He is in his early 30s, and I just by looking at his bio, I just saw so much of myself in him. So we had a chance to talk for about 20 minutes, just exchange some ideas, give him a frame of reference that he could work with, that he could go forward. So I told him now he has my number. Feel free to call me on my cell. And I want to extend that offer to each and every one of you as well. I mean, if you look at my LinkedIn profile, my contact information is there. Feel free to call out to me if you need an encouraging word or, just something. Because I think that one of the things that we lose sometimes is perspective. And, the way that I go into my consulting business when I would work with clients, if I go and work with a client and, I'm meeting with them and everyone's telling me, I ask them, well, what's the weather like outside? Yeah, it's a facetious question. But for point of illustration, oh, well, the sky is still green and and it's kind of dreary, and I'm like, really? And after the meeting, I kind of sneak a peek outside, and the sun is shining, and the sky is blue. So my first question is not they're wrong and I'm right. My first question is, what am I missing that they're saying the sky is green? Well, come to find out, they have these special lenses that they put on. And, so when they look out in the sky, the sky is gray and pretty bleak. So, I use that as a facetious point, but it's really all about perspective. And, for those of us who have been through these cycles before, I mean, our form of economy is nothing more than it is cyclical in nature, right? The Soviets, in their central planning, tried, everything was supposed to go according to the plan. Well, the plan always failed because the plan could not take into account changes in people's attitudes, discretions, whatever. And, they tried to build an entire society out of that, and it failed. We build on a society based on individual choice, and that's what makes us prevailing. Now, if we didn't have $36 trillion in debt, we'd by far be the greatest nation on earth. Not to say that we're not, but just from an economic sense, we'd be far greater now than we would be. I'm also sporting, for those who've noticed, my latest Air Force swag. I should say over here, from Fanatics. It just came in, and I love it to death. So, the mic goes and keeps out the Air Force, but as you can see. So I also got it in blue, so makes me look extra cool. All right, let's talk about this whole issue of justice, because I think a lot of people, I use the expression getting wrapped around the axle, but it's very, very true. And I want to start off with these two images about Lady Justice. Okay. There is a difference between justice and vengeance. Okay. Vengeance is taking out of passion for something that has happened. Justice is taken out of reason and logic. That is the reason why we have a court system. Because with the prevailing of facts, now, do court trials get passionate? Yes, indeed they do. But it is up to the judge that is running his courtroom to keep that to a bare minimum. You'll see scenes where people in the gallery get extremely raucous, and the judge is banging his gavel and basically saying, order, order in the court, I'll clear the court. Well, the reason why he's saying that is that he cannot manage a raucous courthouse and have any semblance of justice. So that's the reason why we do this. Now, of course, justice as depicted here, is three key elements. First of all, it is a balance. Therefore, the prosecution and the defense have to, by the weight of their evidence, if you've ever heard that term before, right? You put a weight on a scale to countermand. So, for example, if I'm buying, let's say a certain amount of grain, okay? Well, in one side of would be a certified, let's say 1 pound weight would put on there, but then the other side needs to be filled up. And then when the scales are even, that way I have known that I have bought truly 1 pound of grain. That's the way it's supposed to. Now, of course, you've heard of expressions of putting your thumb on the scales, which means it's undue influence. And therefore, Lady Justice, although she's blindfolded, I should say, really gets blindsided by the addition of that extra influence on there. That's not the way that's supposed to work. So we have the balance. We also have the fact that she's blindfolded, that it is purely on the weight of the evidence that the case will be determined. Now, of course, in reality, does that always happen? Sometimes maybe Lady Justice sneaks a quick peek, but then the third and the most influence, especially and this taken in front of the Supreme Court building with the expectations equal justice for all, that justice should be provided without the influence of rank, privilege, or money, or whatever. But we also know in reality sometimes that doesn't happen. So that's still the desired outcome. And that's something that we should work very hard every day to prevent our system from becoming out of balance, as it were. So what I want to do now is I want to start with the idea of the military versus the White House. As you notice, there have been two significant firings that were noted over the weekend, starting on Friday night. I believe one was the firing of the Air Force Chief of Staff C.Q. Brown, an African-American four-star general. And then there was Admiral Francesa, I believe her name is. She was the first Chief of Naval Operations. That is her title, but that is the title officially afforded. They don't call the Chief of Staff of the Navy. She is the Chief, or was, I should say, the Chief of Naval Operations. But it is a four-star flag rank. There have been five-star admirals. Chester Nimitz was one of them. I believe Bill Halsey was also another one. But that was only during times of World War II when we had allies that had the equivalent rank of a field marshal. That is why the five-star rank was introduced. But in this case, our first controversy will involve a five-star general, and that was Douglas MacArthur. Now, Douglas MacArthur, after World War II, having won the Pacific through his island-hopping strategy, settled back into civilian life. However, as a five-star general, you were never completely taken off of the rolls. You are almost essentially, you're retired on active duty. Well, unfortunately, we had this little thing called Korea that crept up when the communists flooded nationals over the Yalu River, that effectively serves as the natural boundary between China and originally, I'm sorry, I take that back. Originally, it was the North Koreans. Forgive me. This is where I get my facts mixed up, but just forgive me. Okay, originally the Korean War started when the North Korean nationals flooded over the 38th parallel. That had been the line of demarcation between the two Koreas. South Korea had basically chosen to a liberty mode, for lack of a better term, and adopted the Western form of liberalism, whereas the North Koreans had basically accepted Stalinism on there. Now, originally, now, having said that, the reason why Truman was meeting with MacArthur was because when the Chinese flooded over into North Korea, because what happened was the American forces had effectively beaten back the North Korean forces literally to the Yalu River, that they were to the point of making the entire North Korean peninsula free, which would have been a beautiful thing for the Koreans. But at that point, the Chinese could not tolerate a free Korea on its border with Korea. So at that point, that's when they flooded in over 400,000 nationals in there. And unfortunately, that was the famous retreat. Now, I know there was a Marine Corps general saying, we're not retreating, we're just moving in another direction. But for all practical purposes, it was a retreat. And once again, there was a stalemate at the 38th parallel. Well, prior to getting beaten back, Douglas MacArthur said, no, we need to widen the war. We need to defeat the true enemy. And the true enemy was China. Sound familiar? But unfortunately, Truman felt that any aggressive action then would bring in the Soviets. And since the Soviets at that time also had the bomb, he feared that it would basically be the start of World War III. Well, whether or not that would actually happen, I'll leave to the historians. But the whole point is that as a result of that, is that basically Douglas MacArthur had put out a statement saying that we needed to expand the war to China. Now, at that point, he had placed Harry Truman, because Harry Truman, being the commander-in-chief, either had one or two things. Either he had to support MacArthur, say, yes, that's exactly what we will do, or he had to fire MacArthur. So he fired Douglas MacArthur and replaced him later on with Matthew Ridgway. Over here, these are some of the pictures that go and show Truman relieves MacArthur of all his posts, finds him unable to back U.S./UN policies. Ridgway, which was Matthew Ridgway, named to Far Eastern Commands. Now, it's interesting to note that this was the first conflict where the UN was cited as a partner. The United Nations was not formed prior to 1947, which obviously would have included World War II. So the fact of the matter is that when the UN had formed, and of course the U.S. was a founding member, but so was the Soviet Union as a member of the Security Council. So Truman just felt that he couldn't have it. It's also interesting to note that this particular picture of MacArthur is showing him with his 4-star rank instead of his 5-star rank. He was actually promoted to a 5-star general while he was in World War II. So that was an old picture of Douglas MacArthur. So as we go and we look at these various facts, this was the other picture that I wanted to go and show with Matthew Ridgway. So basically, free thinking MacArthur talked back to two presidents. Well, he talked back to FDR because the whole island hopping strategy that he wanted to pursue was in relief of the Philippines. He felt that he had been disgraced by being pulled out of the Philippines by Franklin Roosevelt. Unfortunately, one of his other generals had been left behind, was eventually captured by the Japanese. And at that point, he felt that the only way to redeem himself was to redeem the Philippines. And that's exactly what he did. And he fought FDR on that. And basically, he fought FDR on a political basis that basically said that if you don't do this, you are basically saying to every single brown-skinned person in the United States that they are not worth fighting for. Now, that's a pretty ballsy thing to say to your commander-in-chief. But in all actuality, it was true. So the fact of the matter is that, yeah, he may have talked back to his president, but he made it perfectly known that this was going to be unacceptable as that adoption of what the Navy wanted, which was to avoid the Philippines whatsoever, basically to try to get as close as you could to Japan, to get to Okinawa, and then try to mount an offensive from Okinawa. And MacArthur said, no. If we retake the Philippines, we have all these resistance fighters that are there looking for U.S. leadership, and this is how we can do it. And ultimately, he prevailed. And that's why he did it. And ultimately, they did. The Philippines were recaptured in a matter of months, driving out the Japanese. So, from that standpoint. So, there's your historical fact. So, now let's go fast forward into 1960 and the presidency of John Kennedy. John Kennedy had a very difficult relationship with two aspects of his government, one being the CIA, the other ones being the Joint Chiefs of Staff. We'll start with the CIA first. The person on the left side in that picture is Allen Dulles. Allen Dulles was the head of the CIA. He was also the brother of John Foster Dulles, who ran the State Department under the Eisenhower administration. The State Department was run by a gentleman by the name of Dean Acheson, who had actually been a resident of the great state of Georgia. And Acheson, this had been his first cabinet post. He was basically from academia, but it was his job to run state while Kennedy was in office. Dulles, through his secondary, Richard Bissell, who was like the head of operations, but basically the number two at CIA, had come up with the plan of the Bay of Pigs. And that plan failed. It failed miserably on a number of different accounts. But the whole point was it was a CIA plan that had first been presented to Eisenhower. Eisenhower approved it, but then again, Eisenhower was not running for a third term. So Kennedy was elected. The CIA briefed him in the transitional plan and basically implemented this plan in April of 1961. It was an abysmal failure because they could only land about 1,800 insurgents on the island of the Bay of Pigs, number one. But number two, and more importantly, Castro knew about the plan because Castro had plants within the infiltrators and basically knew everything. And matter of fact, not missing to take a chance to beat back the northern invader, Fidel was personally involved as the military commandante. So he ran his forces and we tried to run ours. And what happened is that as our people were either getting shot up on the beach or being driven into the swamps, Dulles was leading with the Joint Chiefs of Staff, which I will show shortly, but basically pursuing them to say, now we have to actually intervene. And Kennedy said, we're nuts. We intervene militarily there, they're going to go after Berlin or somewhere else there, and we are going to be in World War III. So unfortunately, the people were captured. There were, I believe, over 900 of them that were killed. Eventually, Kennedy was able to get a negotiated, and there was a movie with Tom Hanks about that, the insurance executive that was pulled into that because he was an expert negotiator to go into negotiate the return. I believe the price tag was $51 million in assistance, including baby food. That's the first time I've ever seen another country pay another one for hostage ransom and baby food, among other things, medical equipment, etc. So even then, the Cuban state was failing. It was not delivering what it would promise the people, but we got the people out. Now, does it mean that the Cubans didn't hold resentment about that? Oh, I'm sure they did. And moving forward, that has led to some people saying that the Cubans were involved in the assassination of JFK and that sort of thing. But that's another video. Okay, so as we go and we move on, here was the Joint Chiefs of Staff as Kennedy had assumed it. You had Admiral Anderson on the left-hand side. The Army General, I couldn't get his name before the video. That's my bad. General Levenser, and we're going to talk about Levenser a great deal. Curtis LeMay representing the Air Force, and then General Honor, again, the Marine Corps Commandant, the only Marine Corps Commandant that earned the Medal of Honor. He was a heroic man, a very patient man from what I've been told, but, as any Commandant, loved the Corps, and he loved his Marines. And that's the way we like our Commandant in the Marines. So let's talk specifically about John Levenser. John Levenser was not well liked by the Kennedy White House. although he was a highly decorated officer, as you can see, John Levenser was probably at best a bureaucrat. His job was to take care of the Army and to take care of the armed forces, but basically to make sure that the funding for the military was constantly increased. The through Curtis LeMay, for example, the reason why the United States had 1,000 Minuteman missiles as opposed to 3,000, which Curtis LeMay wanted, was because of the direct intervention of Secretary McNamara to go and to basically talk the Air Force down. But basically, he was not going to build 3,000, and based on the current Soviet capability at that time, even during the times of the Bay of Pigs and the Cuban Missile Crisis, we found that the Soviets had at one time only 4 missiles that were operational. If they were relying on to deliver a nuclear threat, it was not going to be by intercontinental ballistic missiles. It was going to be done by heavy bombers, and the Air Force felt that we could reasonably shoot the bombers out of the sky. But of course, if you give an inch, they'll take a mile, and was Levenser's job, was to constantly increase the budget of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. During one of the famous reforms that Kennedy tried to institute was after the Bay of Pigs was taken, and you'll see this in the Oliver Stone film, JFK, was taking out the role of paramilitary forces. Paramilitary forces were under the control of the CIA. Kennedy said, no, we're going to get them the hell out of there and put them under the direct control of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, which, needless to say, irked the CIA to no end. However, somewhere along the line, we find that was reversed because after 9/11, the first paramilitaries were not the armed forces of the United States, but was actually the CIA. As I said before, John Kennedy had a very difficult relationship with the CIA as well. In this particular picture, it's rather unique because after the Bay of Pigs, Allen Dulles was fired, i.e. retired. But as Bobby Kennedy told him, under a parliamentary system, we would have to go, but in our democratic system, you, sir, have to go. So him, Atchison, and Richard Bissell were fired. Also, General Cantwell, whose brother was the mayor of Dallas, Texas, when Kennedy was driving through 1963. No more comment on that. You can draw your own conclusions. In this particular photo, you have the Secret Service agent on the left-hand side. You have Atchison, or not Atchison, I'm sorry. You have the previous Secretary of State, Dulles, John Kennedy, and then John McCone. Now, John McCone was actually a Republican, and Kennedy was very famous for bringing members of the other party into his cabinet. He wanted to have a sense of balance with that. So he brought in John McCone, and John McCone became his director of the CIA afterward. But needless to say, John Kennedy wanted to go break the CIA into 1,000 pieces because he felt he was betrayed. So in this case, it's not only the role of generals, but really the role of your intelligence agencies. All right, so now let's talk about Lyndon Johnson and Lyndon Johnson in his cabinet. Okay, so Lyndon Johnson was a tough son of a bitch. That's the only way that you can go and describe this 6'4" Texan. He had been politically astute. He had risen to being the Senate Majority Leader at the tender age of 46. He knew how to push people's button. There was a famous quote: he knew the bourbon you drank, he knew the people that you associated with, and he knew the horse you slept with. That was Lyndon Johnson. However, Johnson, as a result of Vietnam, would also become a very beaten up man. This is a man who consumed a tremendous amount, and this is not me saying this is actually John Connolly, that basically he had the incredible ability to go and to consume both Cutty Sark and cigarettes. Lady Bird tried to get him to cut down on the cigarette smoking, but I'm sure he smoked a lot in private when she wasn't around. Um, he was only, I believe, 64 when he died, and some people think that he just literally drank himself to death after being president. Just being the head of the LBJ Ranch wasn't going to be good enough for it, and he drank himself to death. That's conjecture, and I'll leave it at that. But Lyndon Johnson was a very rich man. If you notice, he is wearing a gold Rolex. He's probably one of the first American presidents that wore a gold Rolex. But the whole point was is that he had to put up with both the military, and this is Dean Acheson. Acheson did stay on in the Johnson administration until Johnson started putting his own people in there. But the whole point is that uh, Johnson had a tremendously tense relationship with the military because of Vietnam. It was on recommendation of McNamara for him to go and to pursue the heavy bombing strategy, but yet it wasn't working, and the longer that it prevailed. And you can see at this point, we spoke about McNamara earlier, but McNamara this is at this point where he started suffering some real physical maladies, and at some point he had to get out because the one of the undistinguished facts of American history is that the first Secretary of Defense, John Forrestal, could have been as a result of the pressure of the job or personal illness or both, was the first Secretary of Defense to commit suicide. He actually jumped out of I think it was a 23rd floor of Walter Reed Hospital, but basically he fell to his death. He committed suicide. As much as they want to say it was an accident because he was on drugs or whatever, it was purely suicide. And I think Bob McNamara was getting to the point where the stress of the job was just too much and he had to get out while he could get out. So now moving forward, who's the next person that we'd like to highlight in this relationship between the president and the White House and the Pentagon? Well, that's this general, John Singlaub. John Singlaub was a two-star Army general that had been stationed in Korea, and he was stationed during the administration of Jimmy Carter. Now, Jimmy Carter was looking for a strategy of going in and making sure that we had less troops. At that time, we had over almost close to 100,000 troops in Korea as what is known as a tripwire. So if the North Korean communists were to attack the South, and even if one American was killed, that would be a tripwire for the Americans to go all in. At that time, it was believed that the United States also had very precious weapons of a very specific kind, actually on the Korean Peninsula at the invitation of the South Koreans. And at that point, Carter wanted to pursue a different strategy. He wanted to get those assets off the island and ultimately to reduce the number. Now, Singlaub's experience had been in special ops and special operations warfare, and he was considered to be probably one of the most skilled generals that we had with that experience. Unfortunately, because Singlaub spoke out against Carter, Carter relieved him. And in this case, he was brought before Congress to go to express his views, where a lot of people found favor with. Now, remember, Jimmy Carter, although he had a Democratic Congress, he did not really have, quote-unquote, a Democratic majority, because although he was a liberal, he was a Southern liberal, which meant that he was okay on certain things, but he wanted to be fiscally responsible. And the Northern liberals, represented by Tip O'Neill, wanted to spend more money on social programs and the budget be damned. So, once again, the president prevails because the president is the commander-in-chief. However, just because you may disagree with what your generals are saying does not make that untrue or irrelevant. And that's something that we seem to, as a nation, have got to constantly learn and relearn. All right, so moving on. Now I want to introduce to you the triumvirate of Ronald Reagan. Now, these men were not generals, but they were very important people in there. These were the three people that Ronald Reagan brought with him from California. The first is James Baker. James Baker was to serve initially as Secretary of the Treasury. You had Ed Meese, who became the head of the Justice Department, and then you had Michael Deaver, who served as special assistant to the president. But the whole point was is that Deaver, this triumvirate, was the ones that kept Reagan kind of on balance, kept him on message, and just made sure that nothing was lost in the weeds. So the fact of the matter is that with these three men, Reagan could do that. Now, the reason why I brought them in there is because the very fact of who the president chooses as his advisors will be the very same people that can keep him on message, will make sure that he doesn't get diluted. Now, some people will say that after the assassination of Ronald Reagan, um, he lost a little bit off of his game. And some were even saying that by the 84 election that there was enough spin that was lost off of his fastball. And that's when, he kind of got lost in the first debate in the first part. But what really killed it and really assured Reagan was that comment, about, the, and I'm paraphrasing, but, Mr. Reagan, you'll be such and such age if you get reelected. Do you feel that, because of your age, that might be an impediment to your presidency? And that's when Reagan became Reagan. It was like you can almost see it on there as if his eyes instantly got animated, and he came back with that famous quip that that he was not going to use age as a detriment because of the youthfulness of his opponent. I'm paraphrasing. You can see the YouTube clip. Brought the house down. I mean, back then, that's the thing about the news people are just so serious. They have that news look face like, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Tonight the bunnies were attacked by the wolves in the Midwest prairie, and it was an ultimate slaughter. I mean, come on, folks. I mean, you have to watch. I should have gotten the videotape, but the whole point is that it is hysterical because Ronald Reagan just literally he brought the house down, and even the news commentator had to break out in a smile. And at that point, that's when people said, we got this. The boss is back. Okay, so having said that, these were the three men that played a very crucial part in Ronald Reagan's first term. But here's what I affectionately call the HR department of the Reagan administration, and that was Nancy. Now, Reagan had a very affable type of personality. He grew up within the disciples of Christ. He had been baptized. He had professed his belief in God. But Ronnie always saw the good in every one of God's children, even in enemies. When he met Gorbachev. He did not go there with an adversarial attitude. He shook his hand. He smiled at him. He welcomed him almost like a brother. But the real HR department was Nancy. And trust me, if you could not pass Nancy, and Nancy had this innate sense, I mean, you want to talk about a yin and a yang, but Nancy had, I would say, a sense of cunning, a sense of, you're only here to promote your own self. You're not here to promote Ronnie, and therefore I'm not having now the story about Nancy and the astrology or whatever. But she was the HR department, and she would play a part later on because of here that Reagan said, I took an oath of office to pledge loyalty to only one special group, we the people. That is very much Ronald Reagan. However, going back to Nancy was the one, and I'll tell you the reason why. Don Regan was the chief of staff, and Nancy made a point to call directly to the chief of staff's office. And finally, Don Regan had just had enough of it. It was 7 o'clock. He had no lunch. And he just basically he said, "Yeah, Ms. Reagan, I'm going to take care of it with the president like tomorrow morning," and just hung up on her. Well, that evidently was a huge no-no, and there was going to be hell to pay. And the adage is that uh, Reagan heard about him getting fired from some other staffer, not even from the president, and he just typed this one word, "Miss Reagan," or "Mr. President, I resign as your chief of staff, effective immediately. Today's date, Don Reagan." And he got in his car and left, and he never met with Reagan ever again, even after his presidency. He was that hacked off. Well, it's unfortunate, but it happens. I mean, you cannot. I don't care how good of a chief of staff you are. You are never, never, ever going to be able to compete to a woman if we have a male president, or a a man if we have a female president, excuse me, or a female if we have a man president, whispering in their ear. And if they're whispering in their ear, "Honey, I love you, but Don Reagan's got to go." Reagan was like, "Okay, Nancy," and even Reagan apologized that he just, he had that lack of spine, and I think that unfortunately that was, uh, you know, an attribute that was to his detriment and not to his best. So let's talk present day, and I want to go and bring these two pictures. Okay, the first picture on the left is General Jack Keane. He served as the Army's Vice Chief of Staff. He's a four-star general. Frequently, he is a commentator on Fox News when it comes to military and international relations. The president is presenting with him with, I believe, the Presidential Medal of Freedom, which is now that Jack Keane is no, he could be recalled to active duty, but he's retired military. So in this case, he is, in all case, a civilian. However, he is a very strong Trump supporter because he's a strong supporter of our military. The gentleman on the right is H.R. McMaster. H.R. McMaster also served as Chief of Staff of the Army, or I'm sorry, he was a three-star general, but served as Chief of Staff for the White House. Forgive me. But the whole point is that McMaster also had a few opinions about his boss that were supposedly not very complimentary. I think that this is one of the things that Trump has learned from his first term versus his second, is that although military generals can be great advisors, having them as your chief of staff is not a good idea, because they're people who are used to high authority themselves. They're used to making decisions, and the chief of staff's office is not a decision-making role. It is purely a staff support role, which means you are supporting the boss. You are making decisions in terms of, you serve as a gateway to the Oval Office, okay? But you should not be a total wall so that the boss only hears your opinion. And I think that was something that may have come up in that relationship, but as a result of that, H.R. McMaster was not chief of staff. Trump went through a lot of chief of staffs in his first term. Now he has Ms. Wiles as his chief of staff now. She is a political operative from Florida, which Trump is from. She's also the daughter of Pat Summerall. And I've tried to reach out to Ms. Wiles directly through the White House. The White House has a thing where you can send an email, and I've sent a message to her because I wanted her to review one of my videos. But the whole point is that she seems to be very capable. She's keeping the boss on message. And if you notice, she's been out of camera range. Previously, a lot of the chief of staffs, even when Trump has the executive orders to sign, she's not within camera shot. So that's a very interesting aspect. So, getting back to the relationship between the generals and ultimately the commander in chief, that relationship must always be preserved. Now, there was a movie that was actually filmed during Kennedy's administration that he actually indirectly took part of, and that was the 7 Days in May. You'll see a lot of exclusive shots within the White House. Well, what happened is that he gave the director John Frankenheimer very exclusive access to the White House. The scene where the so-called president, played by Frederick March, is in there, is the actual White House pool. Kennedy went to Camp David for a weekend and basically told the crew, if you want, you can get access to that. And he gave him access to the Oval, to the swimming pool, and some other parts of the White House. And it was quite authentic because Kennedy felt that this book was so important and really his presidency could be the proxy. Clearly, after the Bay of Pigs, if enough of Americans felt that he should have been impeached or ousted, the military very easily could have led a coup d'etat, and our system of government would be changed forever. So he felt it was important for this movie to be made so much to the point of saying, listen, I'll give you the White House. Make it authentic. And in the end, I don't want to be a spoiler alert, but the desired result does not happen. Order is restored. And we now press on to the society we now live in. Okay. So moving forward, and this is going to be kind of like my last grouping, and this is a picture of John Marshall, who served, and he was a 5-star general, served as both the chief of staff of the Army, but he also served as Secretary of State under Harry Truman. And I think this is a very much a real representation of what the man was. The man certainly knew his role as a 5-star general, but he also knew his role as a Secretary of State. So he knew, for example, Marshall was there when the United States recognized Israel, and there was some concerns that he was not agreeable to that position. But that was a decision for his commander-in-chief, as the President of the United States, as the chief policymaker of the United States. The policy of the President is the policy of the United States. It is not the policy of the State Department to set the policy of the United States. The State Department is there to fulfill the policy of the United States, how he has communicated to his Secretary of State. So when we look at men like John Marshall, in our current Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, I feel that is that relationship. Now, Rubio has never served in the military, but he is now serving as Secretary of State. The fact that he is bilingual, by the fact that he's focusing on Latin America, he'll address China in good order, don't get me wrong, but he's really reaching out to the entire North, Central, and Southern Hemisphere, kind of as not the American hemisphere, but the hemisphere that includes all of us. And knowing that the United States will be a lead partner in that, but the United States will not be the lead aggressor as the Soviets were with the Eastern Bloc. So let me go and wrap this up by going and saying and having this picture. I found this to be an unusual picture. Maybe this is the start. Now, I can say that the president can be very charismatic, but in this case, look at the troops. The troops are at best very demure. They're trying not to be judgmental, but as you can see, some of them are not happy for whatever reason that he's there. Maybe he got him up early in the morning to be there. Maybe they don't like to be seen as a backdrop for their commander-in-chief. Certainly, that could be understandable. But I think at the end of the day, this commander-in-chief really loves those troops as their own. And I think that if he had the opportunity to just embrace each and every one of them, I would hope that they would get the message. Now, am I saying that every single one of those troops are registered Republicans? Absolutely not. I have no reason to believe that. However, they are members, in this case, of the United States Army. They know what their role is, and they certainly know who he is. And the best thing that man can do for all of them is to keep them out of harm's way for as long as possible, to rely on other methods and techniques other than being able to say, I can move, pieces of my military around the globe. I can move a carrier group into the South China Sea like tomorrow. I can move a task force into, the Straits of Taiwan. Okay? Let's face it. America, we're not great at provoking wars, and frankly, we don't want to provoke wars. But unfortunately, we've had to finish wars that we should not have been a part of. And God willing, if this man does his job correctly, 4 years from now, they will be alive, whether to reenlist or to go back to being the citizens that they were. But that is going to rely on the relationship that Trump has not only with the military, but with the Congress, and really to each and every one of us. So, once again, thank you so much for checking in. I really appreciate it. And we'll be seeing you around campus. Talk to you in a bit.